Order. And it would be a great pleasure to welcome to this public session our today's two witnesses, Lord Vallance, the Minister for Science, and Alexandra Jones, Director General for Science, Innovation and Growth. And Lord Vallance, we have this is the subject that your portfolio is of huge interest to this committee, as you can imagine. We're very grateful for your giving us so much of your time this morning, but we do have a wide range of questions, as you could possibly have anticipated. So it's a testament to the work that the department is doing that there's such great interest amongst members, and indeed a couple of members are have unfortunately unwell, or they would have been here today as well. So we will get through the questions as quickly as possible, but I do really appreciate you giving us as comprehensive responses as possible. And my first question, given this is your first 7 months into post, it's been a very interesting 7 months. How would you assess your first 7 months in the job? And as someone who was previously the Chief Scientific Advisor to ministers, including George Freeman here, what are the challenges in going from advising on policy as a Chief Scientific Advisor to actually making it as a government minister?
Thank you. Well, it's a great pleasure to be here and to have an opportunity to talk about this area. Maybe I'll start with the second half of that question. Clearly, the role of the Government Chief Scientific Advisor, as you rightly say, is to advise, and it's to advise on science for policy. So it's about making sure that policy is well informed by science across government, whereas this job, of course, is around policy for science. So it's the other end of the spectrum, and of course it's also about making decisions. And so that is a transition. It's different. There's some overlap. I'm very conscious of the fact we have an excellent Government Chief Scientific Advisor, and she should be allowed to get on with her job without me getting in the way, and she does. I'm also conscious of the fact, as somebody said to me, that I can't advise myself. And so I'm grateful for the advice that I get from officials and from chief scientific advisors and the National Technology Advisor. In terms of the first 7 months, as you say, a lot's happened, and I'm pleased that we got a good spending review settlement, yes, which was during a very tight budgetary situation. I think it was important that we did, and I think it reflects how government sees science and technology as an important part of an economic growth story. So that I think is good news. I think we've made progress on UKRI and Innovate UK, both of which we hope to be announcing new chief executives of shortly. And I'm very keen to make sure that we have a very clear view of the different activities that UKRI undertakes, and I'm happy to say more about that in due course. We've also got the Regulatory Innovation Office set up, which has begun to work with regulators in a number of areas, and again I hope that we'll be appointing a chair to the Regulatory Innovation Office very shortly as well. So there's a lot that's happened on the structural side of things. And the area that I would probably then highlight is the missions R&D fund that we've put in place, which I think is very important, because what I would like to do is to make the notion of using science and technology a routine in government, rather than something you go and look at when you think you've got a specific science and technology problem. And so what we're doing with that programme is to ask the mission boards, what are the 3 or 4 top problems that you have that if you could solve them, either through knowledge or through a product or a technology or something else, your mission would go faster and be more effective. From that, we're taking an R&D challenge, which is, okay, if that's your problem, this is the R&D challenge, and we will then bring together the necessary players from industry, from charities, from academia, whoever it might be, to try and address that question with a very targeted approach. This, I think, does 2 things. It means that the R&D is completely focused on something government cares about, and it does so in a time frame relevant to the decision making that government has to make. The second thing is it provides a very clear pull factor for the R&D contributors, because the mission board has said this is a big problem, and if we can fix it, we'll do something about it. And so you've got that sort of potential procurement pull linked to it, which I think will be a magnet for private sector coming in. So that's early days, it's just getting off the ground, but I think that's important.
How much is that fund?
Well, the initial fund in the first wave is 25 million, but
right.
obviously that was the 1 year programme, and the chances of us being able to spend more than that in that first year is limited, but we'll ramp it up quite significantly.
Right. Okay. Thank you. I think you've raised a number of issues that we will return to, but I did want to just talk at a sort of high level that a lot of the headlines which are coming out of the department, and this week we have the AI summit, for example, have seemed to be on digital policy, and that obviously follows on from the changes to the machinery of government, which will come to. Given the focus on digital policy, if you would agree with that characterisation, how do you make sure that the science priorities in the portfolio make progress?
Well, it's quite right that the department is focusing on trying to get some of those digital things sorted out across government. They're absolutely crucial. And they're crucial for the way government works, for the way public services are delivered, and indeed for the economy. So I think that's absolutely right, and it's good that it's come into one place with a cross-government view. It's also worth saying that of the departmental budget, 13.9 million, the vast bulk of it, is for science and technology. So there's no question that science and technology is the major funding position of the department, and my job is to make sure that science, technology and the innovation that stems from that is properly reflected in what the department does.
Fantastic, thanks. Thank you. I'll ask George.
Thanks, Chi. Morning, Patrick, Alex. It's a linked question, actually, on the science and technology framework. Firstly, perhaps if I may just say, Patrick, what a joy it is to see you in post and the continuity that it brings. As you know, I try to do the job in a cross-party, long-term way. I think this agenda and this committee is very focused on long-term policy making. So I just, for the record, wanted to say how great it is to see you in that role to deliver that. One of the things we worked together on was the science and technology framework, which I think was a really important, unglamorous statement of the importance of building a cross-Whitehall commitment anchored in number 10 in the Cabinet Office to drive the harnessing of science and tech for industrial and competitive advantage. So I wanted really just linked to Chi's opening question, just to ask, in the industrial strategy the government has laudably, in my view, made a commitment to, we haven't heard much about the science research harnessing it for industrial benefit. And I'm just wondering, in that framework, does the framework still survive? In particular, how do we drive the cross-departmental commitment? Regulation, I know DBT is the lead department, and yet the regulatory office is in DCIT. And in defence, a key adopter, space, defence for all sorts of sensible reasons keeps itself to itself a bit. So I'm just sort of wondering how you're going to drive the industrial strategy in science across Whitehall through that framework.
Yeah, thank you. Well, first thing to say is that, as you know, I feel quite attached to that framework, and you're right, it's sort of unglamorous in a sense, but it absolutely is the sort of systems approach to how you get this right. And it was widely welcomed by industry.
Yep.
It's been reaffirmed as the foundation of what we're doing in this government. That is the way that this will be considered, and it's informing every aspect of the industrial strategy. So it's very much at the centre of how the industrial strategy is being constructed. And of course, two of the sectors are directly DCIT-led, life sciences and digital and tech, and several of the other sectors have major DCIT input. But you're right, this is a cross-government activity, and the aim of the framework and the aim of what I described on the missions programme is to get science and technology embedded everywhere. And of the total R&D budget, the public R&D budget, I said 13.9 billion is DCIT, but then there's nearly 6 billion which is across the rest of government. So that this has got to be about taking science and technology into every aspect of the industrial strategy. You can't, in my view, be an economy that grows faster than average if you don't have science and technology companies at the very heart of it.
Yeah, thank you. So I painfully agree. I suppose the question, having tried to do the job, is who leads it? Because inevitably in Whitehall you get departmental fiefdoms, you get a competitiveness. Is it the Prime Minister? Is it Deputy Prime Minister? Is it you? Who actually in government sort of bangs the table and says, action 14, has it been done?
Well, the Science and Technology Committee, which is a cabinet subcommittee, is a prime ministerially chaired subcommittee for exactly that reason. And you'll remember when that was set up for precisely that reason. The second thing to say is that DCIT is not a vertical department only. It does have some sort of vertical traditional things it looks after, but it has a very major horizontal component. And the Secretary of State's been clear about that horizontal role. The Prime Minister's been clear that he wants the Secretary of State to drive that horizontal role across government, across all departments. So there is a clear mandate to do that, and there is the Science and Technology Committee as a vehicle to then bring that back to prime ministerially chaired leadership.
Hugely encouraging. So we needn't worry that the new DCIT framing, the digital department, means that the hard, wet science, the robotics, the agri-tech, the space, all that hard stuff, that won't be deprioritised within DCIT as a new digital department.
I think you'd be surprised if I would sit in this role if that were the case.
Can I just clarify, Patrick? You said that. Did you say that 2 of the critical technologies were led out of your department?
Yes.
And that was engineering.
The 2 sectors, yes.
Through the sectors, okay, not all the technologies, I guess.
Oh, so all the technologies, sorry. The industrial strategy.
Sectors, 2 of them were led out.
And in the
sciences and digital and tech.
And in the S&T framework, just for the benefit of new colleagues, there are 10 work streams, is that right, I think, remember? And I think DCIT owns leads on 4 of them, 5 of them. Well, maybe 7 of them, I can't remember. Can you remind us?
So it's not operating in that way. So in other words, we're not trying to have each of the 10 things owned with being pushed individually. We're saying the whole of the framework needs to be applied to every part of the industrial strategy.
If I may jump in here, so one of the things we've got on the industrial strategy and the growth mission, as Patrick was saying, is an innovation cross-cutting strand, which DCIT does lead. And what that means is as we look across the different sector plans and the work we're doing on growth, we're looking at what are the barriers to innovation, what are the enablers of innovation, how do we do that? So that supports, so we've got the lead on the 2 sectors of the industrial strategy, and we lead on that cross-cutting innovation, which is exactly where some of those conversations about R&D happen, and then the sectors look at the S&T framework as they're thinking about their plans.
And in each department, do they have an innovation lead to work into the innovation cost-cutting stream?
We've got, within these sectors, we've got leads who are putting together the whole plan, and innovation is very much a part of that. And then there's a cross-government structure, so very much mirroring. You've got this S&T committee, you've got a cross-government structure, so we've got leads in each department we're talking to make sure we're thinking about innovation across the department, and then the sector leads might be slightly different, but we've got a way of doing that, yes, across departments.
And where would those innovation leads sit?
It depends on the department.
Right, so not necessarily within the chief scientific advisors.
Often it does. It does. And we have a group that meets across government at official level that brings together CSAs and policy leads to make sure that we've got all the right people in the room to talk about those investments.
Last question. If we want, as a committee, to monitor the implementation of the framework, the success in harnessing science for industrial gain, is there a dashboard? Where should we look? Is it that the Cabinet Committee? Is it Patrick, you? Who's the lead? And where should we look to hold you to account?
Well, I think hold me to account by holding me to account. But I don't think it's right to think of how you monitor the framework. I think it's right to ask how do you monitor the industrial strategy and the application of the framework in that. Right. And then there are some specific things which are worth looking at. Regulation, and you quite rightly pointed out that DBT owns regulation overall. We own the Regulatory Innovation Office, and the reason we own that is because the Regulatory Innovation Office is specifically about how you think about high-tech emerging technologies and regulate those. So it's a rather specific area. We work very closely with DBT on that. But I think there are some features of that which make it appropriate. It sits in DCIT. And then procurement is the other one, which, as you well know, it's a major issue for science and technology. How do you get procurement to give that pull through? And I've alluded to it in relation to the missions programme, but I'm also working very closely with Minister Georgia Gould in Cabinet Office to try and push an innovative procurement programme, because procurement from SMEs has been something that government has traditionally found very difficult to do, and we have to do it if we're going to get the signals right for them.
Great, thank you. Gee, I'm conscious there are lots of questions.
Yes, thank you very much. Emily, you do next.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Patrick, for being here, and Alex. One of the key things that I'm sure is on your plate is the changing geopolitics and attitudes to different science and innovation across the world. And in particular, the last few weeks, we've seen the hollowing out of NIH. We've seen a differing attitude to vaccines, stem cell research, particularly coming from our friends in America. And I wanted to really understand how we're looking at that within your department, within the spending that particularly MRC does, but some of the other research councils, how we're seeing that as a challenge to some of our ambitions, particularly in life sciences, and how we're also seeing that as opportunities. So if you could talk me through a little bit of your thinking around how we are reacting to the changing attitudes.
Yes, well, I've laid out 5 priorities, and one of those is international, for the obvious reasons that although we're an island, we can't be an island when it comes to science and technology, which is fundamentally an international activity. I'm very pleased that in terms of our association with Horizon Europe, we are back in Horizon Europe. We've got those links to Europe, and we've got the potential to really drive new collaborations. And the pickup on that's been good, so we're now in a much better position in terms of the number of people back in Horizon. So the European scene is looking good. We've obviously got challenges elsewhere in the world, in China, where we need to work out exactly what our relationship is. China is, by any measure, a science and technology force to be reckoned with. And we collaborate in areas such as healthcare and in climate, and will continue to do so, but are aware that we need to be careful about how we do so. And then in terms of the US has always been our biggest partner in terms of science. It continues to be so at the scientist-to-scientist level. We've got lots of things going on. I'm sure there's going to be change. We can see change already, and we don't yet know what the consequences of that will be. But I've got no doubt that we will continue to work very closely with the US on aspects of science and technology. We'll work closely with them on quantum, engineering, biology, and things that they're interested in and we're interested in. I've got no doubt that as things settle at the NIH, we'll work out what the relationship is and how we can best continue doing what we've done very successfully over many decades.
So just to push you a little further on that, does this present an opportunity for the UK to step forward on those areas that quite clearly the new administration are not comfortable with federal funding going into? Should we be looking at increasing the amount, maybe through MRC, to fill that void and take advantage of that opportunity?
Well, I think companies will do what companies do. And so, we've already got a number of life sciences companies that are working here, new companies that have come here. And I've got no doubt that we'll also see movement of people around various changes in different countries, and they'll want to come to the UK. UK's always been a good place to do research. And our health funding is strong through NIHR and MRC, and I'm sure that won't go unnoticed.
That's a very nice answer. So my last question is, given those opportunities and given that we're in an attractive environment, do you think that we have the right strategies to attract that global talent to the UK? should we be looking at additional incentives to attracting some of those scientists over to our shores?
Well, if you look at the history of science in the UK, we have always relied on immigration of top talent, and we will continue to do so, and therefore all our systems must be geared to do that. It's why the question of how we get the visa system right is an important one. I was very pleased the Chancellor a couple of weeks ago said that she wanted to push the visa system to be welcoming to scientists and engineers. We know we've got the Migration Advisory Committee looking at that and reading out over the course of the summer, and the Home Office white paper. So there's lots of things going on to try and make sure we get that right. And I think it is important, and I think this is what you're getting at, that we have schemes both in the university sector and the funding through MRC, NIHR, that is attractive to people who want to come here. And you look at our Nobel Prizes, we've been very reliant on people who've come in and worked in the UK, and we've done incredibly well out of that, and we should continue to do so.
Thank you.
Just to lead on from that, do you have a specific message to American scientists, or I should rather say scientists resident in America, who may be concerned at the direction that science funding and science esteem is going in the United States?
Well, I don't know yet what's going to play out in the US, and we'll see how that evolves. What I will say is that great scientists are welcome in the UK, and we will welcome people to positions in universities and elsewhere, and our funding schemes will support people.
Thank you. Thank you. We're now going to move on. Thank you, Amelia. We're now going to move on to AI. Martin.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for being here today. It's great to be able to talk about these things. I come from a long background in digital technologies and worked in mobile phones and all this sort of stuff for a long while. I worry about our generic use of complex terms such as AI and quantum computing. What people talk about as AI today isn't AI. It is purely the adoption of natural language processing, large language models, 40-year-old ideas on neural networks I learned at university, the ability to actually have enough processing power to put all that together to create a generative pre-trained model, ChatGPT. We're seeing that copied, and we're seeing it come out in the DeepSeek. We're seeing it becoming almost usable in just about anything. How do we address regulation in emerging digital technologies when we don't quite yet know what's coming around the corner? How prepared are you for the emergence of alternative AI, the next generation of AI in its, to use the term badly, neural network and large language model and processing? And I don't mean the general AI, which is what AI really is. And how prepared are we for the introduction of Google's Willow chip? Willow is the quantum computing chip they announced on 9th of December last year, which, if we believe the press releases, will be a fundamental, incredibly high step in processing power. We know quantum computing, if they have got it and if it works, destroys encryption. Yep. We have some really fundamental potential areas, and at the moment we appear to be trying to regulate the technology and not the use. You don't regulate a wheel, you regulate the car. So what is the approach that we're taking in an area where we could be seeing some really huge steps taken very quickly?
Right, a lot there. Let me start by saying last week I was pleased to be able to, as chair of the Queen Elizabeth Prize for Engineering, award the prize to 7 people for modern machine learning. Precisely to your point, it wasn't AI, it was modern machine learning, and that was 4 people involved in the algorithms and the neural networks, 2 people involved in the chip designed which allowed that to happen, and one person involved in realizing that you need really good data sets for these machines to learn on. So I agree with your point about nomenclature. It's rather important, and there's a sort of generic AI buzz which one has to be a bit careful of, because it also comes with a generic AI anxiety, which is not true when you're thinking about narrow AI models and other things. So we need to be careful about how we use words. I agree with that. But your point is right, that this technology is moving extremely fast, and there are many people predicting when we get to artificial general intelligence, which some people think is a decade or more away, others think is a year or two away, and lots of people think is somewhere between the two of those. That is why the AI Safety Institute was set up, to try and get ahead of some of these things and to work with the developers to test models as they're evolving. And the AI Safety Institute has done that, and developers have worked closely with them. AI Safety Institutes have been set up in several countries now, and then there was a big meeting of the AI Safety Institutes themselves in November in California last year. So I think there is an attempt to try and get to what is happening, what does that really mean in terms of where these will go, and how can we work with developers at the beginning to look at problems that are going to arise. Because your point is right. If you over-regulate in fast-moving technologies, you kill them. So we can't over-regulate. But if you miss it, you've got a problem as well. So that being expert and being engaged is what the AI Safety Institute is doing. And the reason that we've got the Regulatory Innovation Office is to try and pick up on the fast-moving technologies and ask use applications what needs to happen to get that right. And I would take one issue with one thing. We are at the moment regulating specifically on use. So that is the approach we're taking. We have said that there will be a legislative approach to the most cutting-edge frontier models, i.e. as you go towards artificial general intelligence, and that is the one that we're going to consult on to work out exactly what that needs to look like. The AI Safety Institute will be put onto a statutory footing as part of that process. In terms of quantum, as you'll know very well, there's a big race on quantum going on, and one of the big challenges is error correction. Quantum computers make lots of errors, and how you correct that is going to be key to the success story. We opened the National Quantum Computing Centre last year, towards the end of last year, in Harwell, which has 6 different quantum computing modalities all in one building. And the reason for doing that is because it's not clear yet what's going to win, or indeed what's going to win for which purposes, because it may well be that one technology is good for one thing and another for another. And what the Quantum Computing Centre does is allow people to come in and play around with them and find out what works, and allows people who are working on error correction to think about what error correction you need in different models. So I think we're in a good position. Other countries have looked at that National Quantum Computing Centre and see it as something that really is at the cutting edge of this. And we'll see what happens with the various claims. There are lots of claims on quantum. Error is the big challenge. And you're right, a fully working scaled quantum computer would break all conventional crypt. But as you'll be aware, there's been quantum-resistant crypt has been used quite extensively now, which is very difficult for quantum computers to break. But it does mean historic data you'd still be able to break and look at in an instant. Thank you.
Great. Thanks. John.
Good morning, both. Can I just quickly follow on from that, Patrick, in terms of you've confirmed that the AI Safety Institute will be on a statutory footing. Could you talk to us and update us where we are on the department bringing forward its AI bill, and in particular whether it's going to strengthen its ability, your ability to undertake pre-release testing for frontier models, which has been previously announced, but anything else that you can tell us about where the bill's at?
Well, we're committed to bring forward a legislative programme in this, and we will be launching a consultation on that to get information in due course. I can't give you any more timelines on that at the moment, but it is something that we will do, and it will be limited to that very frontier AI work for the very reasons that we've discussed, which is most AI should be regulated at the point of use, the application of it. And the question is, what is the appropriate regulation for that cutting-edge work? What are the things that you need to be careful about? And again, it's where I think the AI Safety Institute has a big role to play. And it's important that the big advanced companies are wanting to work with the AI Safety Institute. That's a really important signal, I think. And there are examples of things that the AI Safety Institute picked up that they've been iterated with companies, and I think that will be what we'll see going forward.
Great, thank you. Can I just ask, following on from that, whether the Trump administration's repeal of the Biden administration's AI executive order has affected the drafting of the bill and that partnership between the AI Institute and the US counterparts?
Well, as I said, there is no bill at the moment. There is a series of discussions around what this might look like, and there'll be a consultation in due course. At the moment, the AI Safety Institute is going ahead exactly as it's always gone ahead, and I'm sure there'll be discussions taking place today in Paris on these sorts of issues.
Alex, do you have anything to...
Nothing to add to that.
Right. And then just one slightly separate thing, just to follow on from what Marnie said. We obviously saw a lot of noise about DeepSeek and in the press and around the world. Now, as things start to settle down, we're seeing countries like Australia and Taiwan restricting the use of DeepSeek on security grounds. Have the UK got a position on that?
Well, I think our position would be you should always think about where you're putting your data. And DeepSeek, I think, is interesting in the sense that it's shown that there will be more than a handful of companies creating large language models. And that's likely to accelerate, and it'll accelerate innovation as well. We've already seen that DeepSeek, of course, has the potential to use less energy than other approaches. So we welcome the notion of there being disruptive innovation occurring here. And we're not going to put out guidance on which ones people should or shouldn't use, but offer a general point that just be aware that when you're putting your data into any of these models, that's being then used by definition, so that they'll be able to see it.
Brilliant, thank you. And just on that then, bearing in mind the sort of security concerns and obviously the advice that you would give, you actually see it as I think you've said that you see it as a positive thing in terms of it shows that there is competition growing in the market in AI. Is that something that you see that UK firms and so forth could start?
I think the Secretary of State has said the same. That I think this shows that innovation in this space is really pretty strong, and we've got lots of innovative companies in the UK, and they're going to be part of this story. And I think there was a narrative developing that the whole thing was going to be, 2 or 3 companies full stop. That's clearly not the case.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks very much, and thanks very much for that, Patrick. And just to sort of clarify, because we didn't mention the European Union in discussing AI regulation, and obviously, not obviously, but there has been some criticism of the European Union's AI regulation model at this week's summit in Paris. Does this, which goes beyond what you've set out around simply, not simply because it's not simple, but regulating frontier models in regard to safety. So does this mean that there'll be divergence with the European Union and the UK with regard to AI regulation?
Well, we're definitely taking the approach of trying to regulate the use, which is a bit different. But we will, as I say, look at the frontier models. It's pretty pointless ending up with completely bespoke regulation in one country because this is a global area. So we're working very closely with the EU, we're working very closely with the US, we're looking at where there are opportunities for harmonisation. And the experience in regulation generally is you get divergence at the beginning when people are trying to sort of work out where to go, but then we quite quickly need to harmonise around this so we've got clear, consistent rules, and it allows people to develop international products. Standards are going to be an important part of this. So it's not just regulations, it's also which standards come through.
Right. And I think the Secretary of State also, and the fact the AI Action Plan talks about open source and open standards as being a sort of pillar of regulation going forward.
I mean, we're very keen to keep things open. We're also very keen to make sure that we put the appropriate protection in place for data so that people get the value that they deserve from the data they have, and that's completely true for public sector data. I mean, we need to make sure that as we make it open and accessible for people to innovate with, we also have systems to get value capture back. So I think there's a lot to be done to get this business model right around data.
Just to follow that up on, come back to the S&T framework, the regulatory point. You're making an important point about regulating by use. So AI in healthcare, widely used for drug discovery, rather different, important, but rather different from AI in the creative industries. Can I just ask again, in that regulatory framework matrix, how are those tensions resolved? How does a government that wants to be pro-AI but not damage our creative industries manage that clutch plate of health want to fast track it for health purposes, but DCMS rightly want to protect creatives? Where does that debate hit in the government machinery?
Well, as you say, there are differences in specific use cases, and the debate around the creative industries is clearly around copyright at the moment. It's really worth saying that in one sense, the copyright is straightforward. If you copy something, you have broken copyright. So you can't take an image and reproduce it, just like you can't read a book and say, I'm going to put great chunks of that book in my book. Mm-hmm. You can, so that's not where the debate is, or it's not where the debate should be, because that's clear. The debate is around web scraping, where an AI machine may look at hundreds of thousands of books in order to try and understand how to write a book. And that's where the debate is, and how you protect. We've been very clear that what we want to do with the legislation, and there are technologies which are going to help with this, we want to give more control to the creatives. We want to give transparency in the system, what has been used and for what purposes, and can you track that through to the output. And we want to make sure that you get access to be able to train these models. After all, the models are used very extensively in the creative industries.
Will this sit with the new chair of the Innovative Regulatory Unit, these judgments about where to regulate fast and slow and how to get that balance?
No, well, they'll sit with existing regulators in that space. For AI in healthcare, though, there's a specific strand for the Regulatory Innovation Office that's looking at that now. And what the Regulatory Innovation Office will do is work with regulators to ensure they've got the capacity and capability and give money for training and share best practice amongst the regulators.
Great. Now I'm going to move on to an area which is very close to my heart, indeed very close to the committee's heart, as it is the subject of one of the inquiries that we've launched, innovation, growth and the regions. It's also very dear to the government's heart, as growth, economic growth is the main mission, and that growth is to be shared across our regions. Now, we had Dame Angela before the committee, I think a couple of weeks ago, and she told us that it was hard to find evidence linking innovation and economic growth. Now, as the Minister responsible for tech and innovation across the missions, do you agree?
I'm slightly baffled by that statement. I mean, most of the fast-growing companies, 7 out of the 10 biggest companies in the world are science and tech companies that have innovated extraordinarily in what they've done, and they're growing faster than other companies.
I guess that's company growth, and I think that would be one set of, if you like, data and research, and the link between companies growing? And I think by growth there, do you mean in terms of revenues rather than in terms of stock valuation? But I think what we're looking at, what we're mainly concerned with is economic growth. So the link between innovation at the company level, but also at the research and development public level, and economic growth on a regional or a national basis.
Well, again, I think if you look at where the companies are, those countries have the fastest economic growth as a result of those companies. So I think it's very clear that there is a relationship between innovation and particularly science and technology companies and economic growths at a national level. It's also true at a local level, but the local level is interesting. So if you look at what's happened in Silicon Valley, of course there's been huge value creation and economic growth in Silicon Valley, but there's been an enormous amount of economic growth that's elsewhere in the US as a result of that, because many of the production facilities, the companies that have spun out from Silicon Valley are based in other places around the UK, so in the US. So you do end up with growth much more widely distributed than just in the cluster itself.
Right. Okay. Thank you for that. I think what you're saying there, Patrick, is that, say, growth in Silicon Valley has caused growth elsewhere, and sort of our not equivalent of Silicon Valley, but where most of the innovation, certainly the R&D funding is focused, is on our Golden Triangle. So are you saying that growth in the Golden Triangle generates economic growth elsewhere, which I think we would agree with, but is part of your mission for looking at tech and innovation across the missions and for growth, is that to look at growth, innovation driving growth within the regions as well?
Very much so. I mean, I think it's true that we've got a massive concentration of very high-end R&D in Oxford, Cambridge, London. That's true. But we've got areas elsewhere in the country that are absolutely flourishing with this. Manchester's doing an amazing job. Liverpool's doing a great job. Newcastle is doing a great job.
I was waiting for
Edinburgh has got a very flourishing sector. Dundee has got some great stuff going on. So this is quite distributed across the country as well. So one of the things, as well as making sure that we harness the full value of what we have in the Oxford-Cambridge growth corridor, and that is an important thing to make sure that we fully get the value from that. We're also looking at what we do to support innovation across the country. And I've had discussions with mayoral strategic authorities about how we can best support them, giving more local control over what the innovation should be, because they know what's happening in their areas, they know what the infrastructure growth plan is, what they're going to do on transport, what they're going to do on the other areas, and we should enable the science and tech innovation to occur in line with what they're trying to do. And I think, again, Manchester's done a really good job of joining that up, and other places have as well. And so I think there are going to be many areas across the UK where we're going to see growth from innovation.
Indeed, we visited Liverpool. The committee visited Liverpool to see their approach to, and we were very impressed by their approach to driving innovation. I know that in the northeast, we very much welcome the Chancellor's encouragement or setting up an investment innovation pipeline with our regional mayor. We have, as Steve and George have particular questions on regional growth. I just wanted to, how do we, it's £20.4 billion, which is, as you said, was hard won from the Chancellor. How can we measure, this committee and the country measure the sort of the value for money of that investment across our country? Can you say what, in a year's time, you would expect us to be able to point to and say that this has driven growth in our regions?
So I'm second to none in my admiration of a previous Science Minister, David Willits, but I will disagree with something he said in the House of Lords recently, which is the job of the Science Minister is to ensure you get the biggest budget for science. Of course, I'd like to get a big budget, but that's an input measure. And what we need to ensure is that we have the best possible use of that money to get the maximum effect for the UK. And I talked briefly, or I mentioned my 5 priorities, and I'll just spell them out if I can, because it speaks directly to this topic. So the first thing that I think we need to do as a country is to protect and grow, as the economy allows it to grow, basic, curiosity-driven, investigator-led research. That brings no economic value in the next 5 years, but it's the thing that people are going to be extremely grateful for in 20 or 30 years' time. And it's something we're really good at, and we must absolutely protect that. We're known around the world for it, and it is the foundation for everything else. The second bucket, though, is more applied research, which should be aligned to government ambitions, growth ambition, industrial strategy, missions. And there, not only would you expect that to be aligned to government missions and approaches, but you'd expect to get a leverage of at least 3-to-1 private sector funding to go alongside that. And you'd expect to see the development of infrastructure that's required for this, including test beds and other things, and skills. The third area is companies, where we've done very well recently in company formation. We've got lots of startups. They are undercapitalised, many of them. That's a problem. So we need to have better, well-funded startups. We need to scale those companies, and we know that's a big gap in the UK. We have failed to scale companies, so we need to make sure our money goes into helping that transition from start-up to scale up. And, of course, we need to support our big R&D intensive companies as well. So those are the 3 funding buckets. And then my other 2 areas are, all of this is in the purpose of the citizen. We mustn't lose sight of the fact that we're doing this because we want lives to be better, and we want people to feel as though they've got opportunity as a result of this. And the 5th is the international one that we worked on. So those are the areas. And the reason for spelling that out is I want this to be much clearer going forward, what proportion we're putting in those first 3 and why. And that then I think would allow this committee and others to say, well, what are we getting back? So bucket 1, curiosity-driven basic research, can we just accept that that is something we're going to do, and let's not have false promises around economic growth from that in the short term. It is the cost of doing business, if you like, and knowledge creation. The second one, though, we would expect to see a 3-to-1 ratio of private to public. And the third one, we would expect to see companies not only starting in this country, but scaling, staying here, getting inward investment from UK investors as well as international investors. So there are metrics in there which I think are the ones we should really focus on in terms of economic growth, and that should be around the country.
Fantastic, great. Let me ask Steve to come in here.
Great, thank you. And I'm sorry you didn't mention Exeter in your tour of the country, which means that we need you to visit to see everything that's going on.
I should say I grew up in Cornwall, and so I do know Exeter very well, actually, and including the wonderful Met Office that's there and the opportunities around that.
You mentioned the 3-to-1 crowding in of private investment for public investment, but in 21-22 UK RI spending was 1.7% in Wales, 6.7% in the southwest, for example, 52.8% in the southeast. So public spending is not equally shared around the country. So can you explain what your role is in that, how you see that going in the future?
The reason that I want to get greater clarity on the 3 buckets of spend is I do not believe that the basic curiosity-driven science will be equally spread around the country. It does happen in certain places more than others, and that's likely to be the case, and it's probably always going to be the case that you have real hotbeds of where this can happen with certain bits of equipment and certain critical mass. The other 2 buckets you would expect to be much more spread. So when we look at where things are, I think that's, again, how this committee should be able to look at this. At the moment, it's quite difficult for the reasons you say. You look at a figure of 1.7% or whatever, that's of the total amount. That's probably not the right way to be thinking of it, but it is the right way to be thinking of it for certain buckets. So you'd certainly like to see the spend on company formation to be appropriately around the country, although you may see certain types of companies in some places and not in others. And you'd certainly expect the spend in the second bucket of things that follow government missions to be absolutely spread appropriately around the country as we think about what needs to be done. And, there's a reason that most of the climate work is going to come to Exeter, because you've got the fantastic public sector research establishment there.
Thank you. But I suppose the question, if the private sector investment into either innovation, startups, etc., follows the public funding largely, then we simply won't be able to rebalance the economy if we don't sort of make a better attempt at making sure that where we do have the innovation, like in Exeter or in Manchester, where we properly support that, rather than focusing on areas that are already successful and might already get that private sector funding.
Yes, again, I don't think private sector funding is going to follow the basic curiosity-driven stuff. So can we park that? At the moment, that's in all the numbers. But you're not going to have lots of private sector money coming in on that. You'll have some, because they want to do it. It's the other bits where we should look at it and saying, are we getting the right amount of spend for the opportunity there? And it's opportunity and spend which need to go together. I do think, though, and I really want to be clear about this because of my role on the Oxford-Cambridge Growth Corridor. As a nation, we will be doing ourselves a massive disservice if we don't deliver on this, because this is a huge growth opportunity for the country as a whole. That's not at the expense of making sure that we do clusters and things elsewhere. It's just obvious to me, anyway, that you must get that right. I was speaking to somebody about sort of international brand recognition, which investors and others are quite keen on. And of course, you don't have to explain that you think that Oxford and Cambridge has got pretty good substrate to start with. I was surprised to learn from somebody that the Chinese actually have a word for Oxford and a word for Cambridge. So, there are things we need to do there, but, and this is an important but, our approach to funding the second bucket of the missions work, and indeed the company, must also look outside, and we must be realistic about where you're going to get, because you're not going to get the high-tech manufacturing necessarily in and around the areas where you get the startups. They often go to different places, and we've got to make sure that we get that right as part of this.
If I may, building on that, one of the things that's happened as well in that curiosity-led bucket is there's been investment over time in some of that excellence. So if you look at the research excellence framework that thinks about the quality of the research, it's striking in the most recent one that's more spread around the country than the previous one, because there's been some long-term investment in capability and excellence, so that that excellent research is being rewarded more around the country. It's not the same, and it will still be clustered. Mm-hmm. On some of the specific work that we've been doing in areas, some of the work of things like innovation accelerators have very much tried to address the points of both applied government, but also thinking about company scale-up. So if you look at the West Midlands Innovation Accelerator, for example, what they've tried to do is actually work much more in partnership with the place to say, what do the companies need? How do we bring the scientists? You've got the hospitals working directly with the scientists to make sure the products are actually usable and can get to market faster. So there's some quite interesting innovations in how we're trying to spend that money, and how you can make sure it pulls through, and that's very place-specific to think about capitalising on that I think we've extended for this part of the SR, and I think we'll want to look at the results of that for the next one.
And I think, just one other point, again, coming back specifically to Exeter. The public sector research establishments have long been, in my view, a rather underestimated part of our system. And, the excellence of what goes on there and the potential for spin-outs and other companies and growth from that is something that I'm very interested in trying to push. And where we have the PSREs, they're often the places that work well with local businesses. They understand the local community. They employ a lot of people, and they train a lot of people. So that's a really good starting point, together with the universities, to think about what we can do to stimulate the growth that comes from that.
Emily would like to come in here briefly. Is that right, Emily? And then,
yeah.
Then we'll go back to you, Steve.
So specifically on the Oxcam growth corridor and your role now in being the champion for that, I'd like to understand a little bit more for your vision around that. Do you see it as an Oxford and Cambridge, or as an Oxford to Cambridge? And what is the role for those towns and cities in between? Are they just to be dormitory, nice places for scientists to live, or are they actually part of that growth potential of the region?
It's definitely Oxford to Cambridge. it's the corridor as a growth area. And, we've got in the middle of that Cranfield University, which is a very interesting applied university. We've got Milton Keynes, of course, and we've got a number of places where we've already can see companies that no longer need to be right close to Oxford or Cambridge, moving out there and creating high-quality jobs. I was visiting some recently where you've got an estate of new high-tech companies growing up along that corridor, beginning to create the high-paid jobs of the future. So this needs to be not primarily about what we can do for Oxford and Cambridge. What can we do as a result of that expansion and the opportunities that lie right the way across there, creating new jobs, better paid jobs, better opportunities for people, better opportunities for their children, and indeed will also be a growth engine for the country as a whole. That's what we need to be aiming for. And of course it helps that once you've got that joined up properly, it makes the whole thing easily navigatable. You then end up with a cluster which is similar to what you see in some of the places in the States, where if your company goes under, and let's be realistic, many of these companies do go under because that's the nature of innovation, you don't suddenly have to move. You can stay there with your family and go to the next job. So I think there is a very big opportunity about wealth creation and opportunity creation right the way across that corridor.
Thank you, Patrick. I don't think George, did you want to come in just briefly now?
I was just picking up my next question.
Right, thank you. Just on the Oxford-Cambridge arc, you're the champion for that whilst also being the science minister for the whole country. Should there be a ministerial champion for the Liverpool-Manchester-Leeds corridor, the Plymouth-Exeter, sort of Bristol arc? What it feels like we might be in danger of gilding a lily that, as you acknowledge, is already well known and is already crowding in private sector investment, whereas actually other areas of the country, there's a huge amount of potential there that we're not necessarily pushing forward.
Well, as I said, I've met with strategic mayoral authorities. We're in regular dialogue about what we can do in other places. I'm meeting a group from Liverpool, I think this afternoon or tomorrow afternoon. Clearly my job is to make sure that we get it right across the whole country. And as I said, those things are not in opposition. I'm going to be very focused on making sure the Oxford-Cambridge Growth Corridor works, but I'm also going to be, in my job, making sure that the country as a whole does well out of this.
Right, thank you. And then just a final question from me on regional inequalities in funding. When we look at venture capital, private equity in the southwest, we get about 2.7% of all of that private funding. Dame Angela, at a recent committee hearing here, said she had joked to a few people that universities should buy some helicopters and ferry them in and out of London and to get them to areas outside of London quicker, because they're based in London. They want to get to the businesses they want to invest in within a day and back. What's your view on getting that sort of private sector capital into startups and scale-ups outside of London and the South East?
Well, where
do you advise buying a helicopter?
Hydrogen helicopter.
Chair, you can answer that question for me, I'm sure. No, look, I think there's an interesting reality about venture capital, which is it's both global and local. And so they can invest anywhere, but when they invest, they do want to be able to visit their companies and see what's going on. And therefore, one of the challenges, and I was working with the Manchester groups before I took up this role, and one of the points I was pushing with them was you need to get the venture capitalists not only to come and visit, but they need to start getting bases there. And of course, they'll get bases there when they see opportunities there. So I think there are two stages. We've got to get the venture people out and around. And you're right that there is a danger that international VCs simply go to the places they've heard of. So part of our job is to make sure they go to the places they haven't heard of as well and visit. And we're seeing an influx of venture firms, actually. We've got more US companies wanting to come and have a base here. And we've got more of our own companies wanting to think about what they're missing out in different places in the UK. But I do think, ultimately, a success is when we've got venture firms that are based in other places in the UK as well, and not just in London.
I might just ask one very brief question. London gets about £1,350 per head spending on transport infrastructure. The South West gets a quarter of that. To what extent is your role also to talk to other departments to make sure that the infrastructure is there to get opportunities off the ground in other places outside of Greater South East?
Well, it's clearly part of what the Oxford-Cambridge Growth Corridor is trying to do, and one of the things I want to do as part of that role is to show how joined up government can work, because it's exactly, the point you raise is right. You've got to make sure all the bits come together, and very often it's fragmented. And so we're trying to run that as a project of integration, which I think will not be if we're successful, will not be the last time we do that integrative work.
Great. Thanks very much. George, a very specific question.
Just on that point, I look forward as a trade envoy to helping support that global messaging about our clusters. And I was just going to make the observation and ask a question on we did set up a regional cluster mapping, digital mapping tool, and I was trying to help tell a global story about how fast they're growing. I think we used the wrong technology. We used a bit of web scraping, and it didn't really map the clusters very well. Is there any work ongoing to support us being able to tell a story globally about, for example, Glasgow, amazing change, Dundee, Aberdeen? Is there some tool being developed still, or is that now parked?
Well, I've certainly seen things on it. You can talk about the tool, maybe.
Yeah, we've been looking at that tool and what are the updates we can make to it and what's it being used for and what's most useful. So I think that it's an ongoing conversation. I think people did like the tool. It has been used. I think there's more it can do. And as you say, the technology develops and the information develops. One of the challenges is capturing, as you know very well, and you challenged us with, live data about these places that really gives you a sense of what.
But I just put in a plea for co-creation. I think if each cluster would love to fill in their own and say, no, you've misunderstood the Cheltenham-Gloucester cyber corridor, and I think if we co-create, it could be very powerful. So I wanted to ask about infrastructure in the context of this regional and national mission. We know that public sector infrastructure is key. And you've been a great champion of Daresbury, the synchrotron, that big, deep infrastructure that only the state can fund. And then we need to attract in and crowd in the private. And I noticed over 30 years in this sector how much the infrastructure has changed. When I was funding companies, all they needed was a fume hood and 2.4 metre and some air handling. Now they need really complex digital. They need access to biobank. Science parks need much more complicated data. And if we're going to scale up, we need to scale up beyond the southeast as well. So two questions, really. One is around how we get the public-private right. And this hasn't been a great area for government over the years. When I came back into government, I inherited VMIC. We tried to turn a vaccine manufacturing innovation hub into a pandemic factory, different skills. The cell and gene therapy hubs are struggling, I understand, to get private sector in. CPI, brilliant place, but we get criticisms that these catapult hubs are crowding out the private sector. And it's a strategic problem, I think, for the UK and an opportunity. So I wanted to ask you what lessons you think we should learn about how we get that private-public infrastructure right. And then there are a couple of specifics I was going to come to.
It's a great question, and I wish I had an easy answer to it, but I don't. But I think it is crucial that we look at the infrastructure and we specifically concentrate on the big bits of infrastructure that can't be done any other way than the state doing it. And that's why the AI research resource is important. So the Isambard AI computer in Bristol isn't the sort of thing the private sector is going to do. The Dawn AI computer in Cambridge isn't the sort of thing that the private sector is going to do. So we need to get these right. And going back to the previous question, if you take AI as the example, the fact that there's going to be an AI Energy Council asking the question, how do we get the power supply to these things, tells you that this does need to be joined up as we look at it. We need to look at the infrastructure we've got and make sure that it is the one we want for today and tomorrow, not just the one that we had yesterday. And that's part of the challenge, how you transition from the past to the future here. I don't think we're going to get private sector into those big infrastructures. We have to fund them from the state to start off with. But then if you look at what happens to them, the private sector starts to use them more and becomes a revenue source for some of these as well, which shows you that you've made the right decisions. But it's not an easy one.
No, thank you. Back in the coalition, when there were some pharma closures, and you were in the industry, we all knew it was. We did successfully set the life science opportunity zones to turn the old sites, Alderley Park, Sandwich. We struggled at Charnwood, but a lot of these old pharma sites, it seemed to me, could be turned into incubators quite successfully, and I think there is some good history on that. Is there any work going on looking at the mapping, particularly in the life sciences, but in other areas as well, infrastructure around the country that could be national assets that we could private-public regenerate?
Yeah. I mean, yes, I mean, if you look at the AI growth zones, that's exactly what that's about. And those zones are likely to end up in places which have got existing big power supply, i.e. industrial sites that no longer have the requirement. So that is something that's happening. On life sciences, yes, it's very much part of how we're thinking about clusters and growth. Where are there opportunities? And as you say, the move of AstraZeneca from its major site in Macclesfield to Cambridge, which could have been an absolute disaster for that area, has led to a rejuvenated science activity there and manufacturing activity there. And I think that is how we need to think about these sites.
Thank you. So there are three just specific little questions one on biobank, which I know you've been a great champion of. I saw some data the other day on patents out of biobank that have been commercially exploited, and nearly all America, very few in the UK, and I wonder whether we're using that infrastructure enough. Secondly, there's a debate running, you'll know, about the Harrow Level 4 containment facility, and having done VMIC, I'm just conscious I just wanted to get your take on whether you think actually that should be led by academia, industry, DCIT, whether that's a public piece of infrastructure or a private sector one, and just to get your take on the lessons from Speak and the AstraZeneca saga, because I think this speaks to whether the UK should and could be doing more to support strategic, particularly vaccines technology. We've got Porton Down, the Jenner. Are there some lessons from the pandemic about how we could deploy better to anchor companies like AstraZeneca?
I'll have a go at these, and I may bring Alex in as well. I was just thinking as you were asking the question how annoying it is to have an ex-science minister on the committee. But biobank, yes, biobank is a huge international resource. It's been a massive success story. It is fueling inventions and discoveries right the way across the globe and attracting companies to the UK. I mean, people are coming because of it and wanting to work with it. So it's definitely had an inward investment success story. And you're right, patents are emerging from some of the use of the data. Biobank was established as an open access resource, which I'm sure was the right thing to do, otherwise it wouldn't be where it was today. But it does come back to a topic we touched on earlier on, which was how we think about protecting the value of data and getting value back to the UK. It's a very critical point, which is going to be important for health data, for public sector data, for biobank data. We need to, I think, be smarter about what business models allow us to give open access, but also value capture. And so I don't know exactly what the answer to that is, but it's something that's being looked at very hard now, and is obviously something that's relevant to the formation of the National Data Library.
Yeah.
How do you do open access, but ensure that you get value capture back?
Yeah.
Category 4 labs. I started a piece of work on this when I was Government Chief Scientific Advisor, because it worried me that we didn't really know exactly what it was we wanted to have in terms of Category 4 labs. There is a piece of work that's ongoing at the moment, and I think we will end up with a clear view as to what's required. It's very important, and I think maybe you're alluding to this in your question, not to create a facility that doesn't have a use. No. There's lots of ideas that people come up with about creating new facilities for X, Y, and Z because they will be useful one day. Well, if they're not useful every day, they don't work in an emergency. So having a sort of mothballed thing or a skeleton, it just doesn't work. So the question for the Category 4 labs is how many does the country need, and to what extent can they be used for everyday purposes, and is that best done fully in the government sphere, or is it best done with academia plus private sector and others? And that's being looked at the moment. So I don't have an answer, a precise answer. On AZ and Speak, obviously it's disappointing that AZ didn't continue with that deal. And we're in discussions with AZ on all sorts of other things as well. I mean, they're a huge and important company in the UK. Vaccines, I think, are broadly in a better position now than they were before the pandemic. One of the things that worried me, both immediately before the pandemic, actually, literally immediately before, and when it hit, was that we'd lost our vaccine industry in the UK, not because of a strategic decision that we didn't want it, but by benign neglect. And we can't afford to do that in areas like this. What I'm pleased about in the vaccine space now is we have Moderna, a £1 billion deal with Moderna, with their new base opened in Harwell, which they constructed in record time, and that's an important new vaccine facility in the UK, and the deal with BioNTech, which is also coming up for being laid in front of the House today, actually, for up to 129 million support from us for another £1 billion deal with BioNTech. And obviously their cancer vaccines work in the UK. So we've got two really innovative companies here now. GSK has put 60 million into Oxford to do more work on vaccines. And when you look across the country, we now know where the fill and finish capacity is for vaccines, with a potential scale of up to 2 billion doses per year. So I think we're in a better position. That's not to be in any way complacent about this. And again, I'll reiterate, I think it's very disappointing that the AZ Speak deal didn't go ahead.
Okay, I'm going to move us on now because we are running out of time as anticipated. And moving us on, though, focusing on life sciences. Martin, I think you have a couple of questions.
Sorry, can you give me a moment to move on to somebody else first, please, Chair?
Emily, you had a question.
Yeah, so so life sciences is one that you have a direct in terms of the industrial strategy, but also it's one of our really important missions in terms of improving health. And I wanted to understand a little bit more on where you see some of that fantastic science work that we're doing, links with the biobank as well, but also the opportunities for sort of universal screening for genetic health in order to move us from the acute to the prevention to the early intervention, and how that work is going on across departments within that mission for a healthier population here in the UK.
Thank you. Office for Life Science is obviously a joint activity between Department of Health and DCIT, and increasingly DBT. And I think it's great that we've got that single point of focus. The Life Sciences sector plan is being developed at the moment, of which Secretary of State for Health has been very clear that he wants an ambitious programme to meet his objectives of moving from sickness to prevention, from hospital to community, and from analog to digital. So there'll be a lot about data in that, and of course genomics is going to be an important part of that for sure. And the UK has done really well on genomics. I mean, the biobank's been a huge success story on how you can use genomics to understand disease. We've got the newborn study of 100,000 genomes being done in newborns, which I think is going to really be a sort of revolution. I mean, it's obvious, but once you've done your genome, you've got it. You don't need to do it. You don't need to repeat the test lots of times. You know what your genome is. And Our Future Health, which is looking at this across 5 million people, is widely seen as a very attractive thing for companies to come and work with us, and will change how we think about using these things in the NHS. And I was speaking to a company about polygenic screening, risk scores, which a decade ago, most people thought, well, you can't really work out what your risk is with common genetic variation. It's just each one's too small. But now people really are being able to do predictive work here. That means you'll know whether you're at higher risk of high blood pressure or diabetes or breast cancer or whatever it is, not on the single gene mutations, but on common genetic variation, and then know what you could do about it to reduce your risk. So I think it truly is a revolution in how we're going to be able to think about preventative healthcare. And I, for one, will be pushing very hard that we look for adoption of these techniques in the NHS early, because that's how we make a sustainable NHS. Innovation is the route to sustainability in the NHS, and that's what OLS will be pushing.
I can see how excited you are by this here, and I think we're all quite excited. How long do you think it will be before this is sort of a universally offered service to people on the NHS in that context of moving to prevention, moving to early intervention, and really just understanding more about our individual risks to particular diseases or cancers?
I don't know is the answer, because it's a difficult thing. It involves service reconfiguration as you think about these things. I visited the Royal Marsden Hospital on World Cancer Day and saw some of the things they're doing with AI for reading scans, for doing pathology. So we've got some really good cutting-edge examples. We need to do that right the way across the NHS. And I know that the Secretary of State for Health and indeed the Secretary of State for DSIP both believe that innovation is the route to sustainability. Therefore, we need to put more pressure on this innovation, not just as a pilot, but as a scale-up right the way across the system. But we all know it's difficult to get change in an organisation that's as big and complicated and important as the NHS. But it is what's essential to do this. So I'd love to say next Tuesday, but I can't.
Thanks very much. Martin has some more questions.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry, I'm slightly diverted because you're talking about the Royal Marsden, where my sister currently is undergoing treatment. I love all the innovation and the fantastic things we can do at the cutting edge. It frustrates me and patients tremendously that they haven't got the basics to build upon in terms of I was waiting for my sister to come back from whatever scan. The nurse didn't know where she was, couldn't find her because reception had gone home, so the systems are not there to support the high-end innovation. I notice that you're not responsible for technology per se, you are science and innovation. So how do you work with the NHS to make sure that there is a sufficiently sound basis of fundamental technologies, patient handling, information, getting rid of letters because the post office the Royal Mail no longer deliver them on time to get to your appointment? We're failing on basic technology whilst focusing on the life-saving innovations. And you can't deliver those life-saving innovations unless you've got a solid basis to work on.
Well, first of all, let me wish your sister well, and I hope she comes through with great success in that treatment. You're right that there are core data and infrastructure issues which need to be resolved, and I think I alluded to that in terms of service configuration. One of the reasons that DSIT was established as a digital centre of government is to try and help everybody to get those things right. And I know that Secretaries of State are working closely together on this, and the Life Sciences Council also understands this and wants to push for those things. And what's frustrating everybody, I think, is there are examples of great practice around. So, there are examples of AI being used to do exactly the sorts of things you're talking about, the management of hospitals themselves, rather than new treatments. But actually, how do you use that to get rotas right? How do you use that to make sure appointments are properly targeted so you don't have missed appointments, and examples where 70% of missed appointments have been reduced by going down that route. So these simple things, and I know from my own experience, I happen to have a general practice that is very, very good in terms of the NHS app and what I can do on it. And I know from somebody 2 streets away that they don't. And so we've got to get these things implemented right the way across the board. This is very much outside my portfolio, but it is something that I care about. I spoke to Secretary of State for Health about this just recently, and I know that that's exactly what DHSC are focusing on, how you get these things right. And it is about using technologies to improve the way the system runs, as well as using technologies to develop the interventions of the future. So I agree with you. And again, I'm sorry I can't give you an answer to say, yes, don't worry, that's all going to be sorted out.
I wasn't expecting one. Can I just draw your attention to the excellent work going on at the Exeter former Nightingale site, where they have radically changed the way they treat patients. So this is largely driven through the Torbay Trust ideas. They have extracted to a non-emergency site huge numbers of low-risk, high-volume procedures and are reducing waiting lists considerably. I know they are showing this off at all sorts of innovation areas, but I think it's important to remember that innovation is not always the latest whizzy shiny thing. Innovation can be looking at a problem and tackling it in a radically different way, as they have done in the Exeter Nightingale, which I think is a beacon of hope for the NHS.
Thank you, Martin.
I'm sure that's drawn to the attention of DHSC. I'm sure they know. But
now we're going to talk about the UKRI and the research ecosystem more generally, I think. George, do you have a question?
Yeah, thanks. The old and vexed issue, Patrick, as you well know, the sort of landscape and the UKRI debate and how does it add value to the research councils. We commissioned, as you know, 2 or 3 years ago, a major report, a review of UKRI by David Grant. It was excellent, very thorough, detailed, and highlighted quite a lot of systemic and structural issues. So as you appoint the new CEO, I just wanted to ask for an update on the implementation of the Grant review and how that's going. And really to ask, as per your earlier question, of the 20 billion a year, you said at the Lords Committee recently that you weren't yet sure how much should go to Blue Sky. I know it's not quite as clear as that, but how much of that 20 billion public money a year do you think should be going Blue Sky, how much industrial, and how much to the other priorities?
Yeah, so there are 3 major reviews of the research landscape, Tickell, Grant and Nurse, all of which have been looked at by the department are being implemented. So I think the UKRI, and Alex may want to say more about it, is a long way down the line of implementing all of the recommendations of the Grant review. And what I said when I came in was, I think it's really important that we make sure we get the most critical parts of these reviews implemented rather than try to do everything on all of them all at once. And I think that's what's going on. And I'm absolutely sure that the new CEO will have views on how best we can do the other parts as well. And the aim should be to give more time for researchers to do research in that setting of particularly in the curiosity-driven research area. Do you want to add anything, and then I'll come on to the other point?
Just on Grant, so David Grant actually was invited back to the UKRI board to assess progress against his review, and gave them a reasonably positive assessment, I think, where he said there was more to do on some of the kind of digital join-up, which is still the case, but broadly he was complimentary on just some of the things they'd done to try and fix the issues he'd said. So a lot, still more to do, definitely, but they felt it was important to get him back, to give him the assessment of how things had gone, and he was, as I say, broadly positive. Data, systems working together, and improving the integration of that were the key things he highlighted, and UKRI are looking at some of that now.
And on your question about the exact amount for curiosity versus the other 2 buckets I described, we're going to be looking at that as part of SR2 to make sure we get it right, and I think one has to be realistic. It's not going to be very different from whatever happens now, because you can't change that overnight and suddenly say you want to put 50% more in one place or another. But I'm very determined that we have a much clearer way of understanding how we're protecting that and how we're getting true growth from the other things we do. We need to make sure the other bits really are focused on government objectives and deliver growth and deliver benefit for individuals and deliver the things that government needs in order to be able to be more effective. And we'll have much harder sort of objectives around that.
Thank you. Just SR2, timing, SR2?
It's coming up for the summer.
Just your answer there, Patrick. I was concerned to hear you say that curiosity-driven research happens where it happens, and where it happens is where it's going to happen. And because I think there are real links between curiosity-driven research, innovation, company startups, etc., and growth, and that some of those links are dependent on geographical proximity. And as we know, research funding, that those people who decide where research funding goes tend to be those people who are funded by research. So how do we make sure that this curiosity-driven research is not simply the same old boys funding the same old boys?
Yeah, sorry, I want to be clear about that. I'm not suggesting that you don't get good curiosity-driven research in all sorts of places, and you should. I mean, frankly, one of the great strengths of our university system is you get taught by people who do research. That is not true in many places, and that is important. So absolutely, you get curiosity-driven research everywhere, but it's also the case we have some real concentrations of places where frankly, you can't do the types of research that go on everywhere. Some need to happen in certain places with facilities and critical mass, and so that's true. Whether it's a big, I mean, what goes on in Newcastle University is going to be different from what might go on in a much smaller university somewhere that can't have the same sort of infrastructure. So it isn't the case that we're going to have it spread equally, and I think we've got to be very careful not to look at this type of research and say it should just be equally across everywhere in the country. There are going to be hot spots where it happens all over the country, but there are going to be hot spots. And then we must make sure that the lone investigator who's got some brilliant idea somewhere can also get access to it. And that's one of the reasons I'm being rather firm about these three buckets is I want UKRI to tell us more clearly how they're going to do this in those three buckets. How are they going to make sure that curiosity-driven research is the thing that the country needs for the future? It's not an area that ministers should tell them what to do. You shouldn't have ministers saying, I want you to do curiosity-driven research in areas X, Y, and Z. Mm-hmm. That needs to be driven by that brain power and excitement that comes from the bottom up. But you can do that in buckets 2 and 3.
We also need to make sure that the brain power is a better representative of the brain power. Making decisions is better representative of the brain power. This is we've only got 15 minutes left.
Yeah, so it's a really quick question. The Labour manifesto committed to a 10-year R&D settlement. Are we expecting the spending review to set out that 10-year settlement? And what do you see the benefits of a 10-year settlement for this area?
So we've done extensive consultation on which areas most would benefit from 10-year funding. It's not every area, because one of the problems that UKRI has had is too much of its money is tied up and it can't change, and too much of its money is done in yearly cycles, so you end up getting money out at the end of the door at the end of the year. So 2 things that I want to see happen for SR2. I want rollover provision. In other words, that you've got some degree of rollover between years in order to manage the spend better. And we developed a series of criteria for 10-year funding on the things that make a big difference, and those would be the areas that we would then put forward for 10-year funding.
Right, okay, moving on now. Thank you very much. Adam.
Thanks, Chair, and good morning, Dave. Thank you for coming. I just want to pull on a few of the threads of things we've just been discussing, actually. So going back to the CEO change at UKRI, Dame Otterline's tenure is due to end, I believe, this June. Have you yet made a decision about who her successor is going to be? And then as you move from her tenure to the next one, what do you want to see continued versus what would you like to see changed?
We're very close to making an appointment, and that will be announced shortly. And I've outlined how I would like to see much more clarity on the different areas that UKRI does. I would also like to make sure that we view UKRI not as a bureaucracy above the research councils, but actually as a way of looking at the diversity of the funding scheme we need to be appropriate for the needs of the country. That means that not everything needs to look the same underneath it, and the research councils are really important. But there could be other ways of doing things, and actually a number of different funding schemes have been set up over the years ideally, those would go under UKRI, because UKRI wouldn't be a sort of monolithic thing. It would be a thing that tolerated differences. And I know a lot of work's been done along this line, and Ottoline has done a great job of trying to move in this direction, but we need to move in that direction. We need much greater clarity on return on investment from UKRI. We need Innovate UK to be really focused on this growth mission and how we get that right the way across the country. We do need to, picking up on the chair's point, we do need to make sure that diversity is there, because diversity inclusion isn't a nice to have, it's an essential if you're going to do great research. I mean, you cannot solve big problems with monolithic thinking. So I'm looking for the new CEO to really think about how they drive UKRI to this sort of lighter touch strategic body, more diversity of ways of funding underneath, more flexibility to be able to go into new things where you need to, and this sort of protection of the thing that is the goose that lays the golden egg, which is all the ideas at the bottom that today nobody really knows about, but there's going to be the sort of thing that is a quantum computer of the future, or the messenger RNA vaccine of the future, or the things that we just can't see at the moment.
Yeah, brilliant, thank you. And a couple of questions now about ARIA, picking up on that again. I think in May 2023 you expressed your opinion at the time was to leave ARIA alone and let them get on with it. Now that you're the minister in charge of ARIA, do you still take that view? Yes. Cool. Fair enough. And given that, in that case, how do we judge ARIA's success and its value for money?
Yeah. So one of the lessons from the initial ARPA organisations and the people who founded those back in the sort of 50s, 60s and so on in the US was the best way to kill this is to keep it on too short a leash. Mm-hmm. And that's what's happened. So I think we're right to make ARIA independent. They've got their first programmes in play now, which I think look exciting. They've got different programme directors from the normal run-of-the-mill. I mean, it goes back to the chair's point about diversity. I mean, they're selecting people quite differently from how universities and others might select them. And they've got a great new scheme, the Activation Partners scheme, which is about attracting people who could take the things that come out of ARIA and turn them into products. And they've got 9, I think, different companies, including 2 top US venture capital firms, that base themselves in the UK specifically to pick up on these things. So we're beginning to see, I think, success in terms of inward investment, interest and attraction of talent. And I've got no idea which of their programmes are going to succeed.
Right. That's fascinating. I mean, this second cohort of these programme directors, I understand, are more from industrial backgrounds, generally with more industrial experience. And touching on the point we were making a few minutes ago about blue skies, do you think that that's going to have an impact on the amount of blue sky research, given that we've got these industry-focused people? And is there a sort of positive, negative aspect of that?
Well, the first round of programme directors was mainly academics, with, I think, two people with industry experience. This time round, I think they've got more people from actually ARPA organisations themselves who've applied for that. So they're getting people from the US wanting to come and work there. It is, at the end of the day, not pure blue skies research in ARIA. It's trying to tackle a problem that is potentially tractable but is really difficult. And so some skills to bring along how you marshal multiple groups to try and tackle a problem are needed. And some of those skills sit in the industrial space. And some of the academics have learned a lot of those skills in the first wave. So I think they're pretty mixed in terms of academics and industrial people.
Now, I mean, how do you think it all builds into the government's growth mission?
Well, I think, ARIA is a long-term play. It's not going to do something in the next couple of years, but you can already see through these activation partners that inward investment is occurring. So we've got interest. So rather quickly, we're seeing some change, even though the programs themselves may not play out for a longer time period. I think it's an exciting, different way of doing work. We're getting a lot of interest from people overseas on it. And as I say, a lot of talented people are coming to the UK. What's interesting about it is people who are in the specific fields sometimes say, well, they don't know what they're doing, it's all a bit naive. People outside the specific field say, that's really exciting what's going on in that field over there. It looks like something new. So we'll see how this plays out. But it's definitely disruptive and doing things in a different way.
Great. And one more theme from me before I hand back to the chair. You told the Lord's Science Committee recently that you were in discussion with the Home Office about visas and attracting talent to the UK. Has there been any progress on the visa front?
Well, I think I alluded to the Chancellor mentioned 2 weeks ago in her speech that she wanted to see visas for science, engineering. The Migration Advisory Committee is due to read out in summer this year, and the Home Office white paper, so that there are lots of things happening. And it's worth saying that the Global Talent Visa, actually the number of people who applied for that increased 10% from 7,000 or so to 8,000 over the last year. So I think there's some movement, and it's being looked at very carefully.
Brilliant. And then final question for me is there a risk, given that kind of focus on global talent and global talent visas, is there a risk that focus comes at the expense of developing homegrown talent?
I don't think so. I think this country has always relied on both homegrown talent and international movement, and we've done really, really well out of both of those, and I think that's what we should continue. We need international science talent to come into this country.
Brilliant. Thank you, Patrick.
We only have a few minutes left, but we actually have 4 really important subjects. Does the Minister have a hard stop at 11:30?
I can go on a little bit, but not a long time.
Fantastic. Maybe say an extra 5 minutes. I think we'll be able to have 2 minutes on each of these important subjects. So, which is diversity, regulatory innovation office, R&D tax credits and VAT, and space. 1, 2, 3, 4. Actually 5. So four subjects. So, do you agree whether are there enough women in the government? I mean, in the different departments in science-related roles. There was an ambition by the previous government to dramatically increase the recruitment of STEM in the fast track for the civil service, which I think has been achieved. But how is what is your role or responsibility when it comes to driving diversity? And this is not only on gender, but on class and on ethnicity and disability, to driving diversity in the public sector and in the private sector in the STEM workforce.
Well, I was very focused on this in my previous role. I was the one who pointed out that 10% of the fast stream had STEM degree, and that's just not acceptable, and got the target to 50%, which has now been met, and that diversity is crucial in that. So I'm very personally interested in this area. But the question of what happens inside the civil service, of course, is more for the GCSA than for me as Science Minister, but I am interested in it. I will keep an eye on it. And we know that it's quite difficult actually to get all of the data, but there's quite good balance at the senior civil service level now of science in terms of gender balance. We are sort of okay on aspects of other aspects of diversity, but frankly, there's work to be done. So I think in terms of ethnic minorities, it looks like it's about it could be 25%. Some of it's unclassified. The data are not really great, but we've certainly got.
What is unclassified?
Well, I don't know when somebody hasn't declared what. So we've got about 11%, which is undeclared.
Right.
75% white, 5% Asian, 2% black, 1.8% mixed, and then on gender, at the senior civil service level, it's of science and tech, it's 46% women, 53% men.
Well, that's much better than the private sector, than the industry equivalent. And
certainly at a senior level, it's much better.
At senior level, yeah. Yes.
Yeah.
So,
and then obviously, in terms of declared disability, it's 10.5%. Declared disability in the science and engineering roles. But there's definitely work to do in this, and I think we need to monitor what's happening with the new fast stream as well and see that we're getting the right balance.
I agree with you that there's work to do, as there is in the private sector as well. I suppose I'm hearing that you don't always have the right data or the right access to data, and perhaps you could write to us and set out how we were going to improve data so that it can be scrutinised by our committee. And I guess in the private sector, what do you see as your role there in terms of driving diversity?
Can I say a word about the data? The data, the problem we've got with the data is definitions of science and engineering roles. It's not the ethnicity data. So there's good data across the civil service on that. So I think it's the problem of identifying exactly who's in a science and engineering role, but we will ask the civil service to try and come up with some way of looking at that. And in the private sector, clearly the private sector will do what the private sector does, but it's definitely my role to make sure that I keep championing the point that you cannot be a solver of problems if you don't have diversity. I mean, all the other reasons to do it are crucial, but there's a simple business reason to do it as well, which is you are much better at decision making, you've got much more effective teams, you've got a much better workplace, and so I will continue to champion that and make that point, as I do almost every time I speak.
That's excellent. George, you
very
very keen to come in.
As well as racial and gender diversity, can I suggest that private sector career diversity is key as well in harnessing science for economic impact? And could I ask, just in the data, if you might be able to come back to us with, I don't know if there is any data on how many of the DSIT staff have got private sector and industry experience. I mean, perhaps offline we could follow that up.
I mean, that very much sits with the civil service and with GCSA. So we've got data, we've got the expert exchange programme, which is a secondment programme, bringing people in and out. We've got a number of secondees in. I'll come back to you.
Come back to us on that. And also, I mean, whilst the private sector will do what the private sector will do, we do provide funding for the private sector, and we do the government department has an impact in shaping and helping to shape what the private sector will do as well, which we look forward to monitoring. John, did you have a quick question?
Yes.
What's the question?
Patrick, sorry for jumping around. The Science and Technology Framework sets out the government's approach to making the UK a science and technology superpower by 2030. When we had the departmental chief scientific advisors here, they did raise some concerns with us about the status of the UK's sort of sovereign capabilities. Do you share any concerns about our ambition to become a science superpower? And if so, are there ways that we can be addressing that now?
Well, we've historically been extremely good at discovery and not as good at development and implementation. And I've outlined ways in which I want UKRI to reform to do that. And it is important we do that because the translation of the science into things that are valuable for society and economically valuable is an important way in which we continue to fund science, amongst other things, and it brings direct benefit to citizens. So, yes, I'm concerned. I mean, I'm concerned in the sense that's exactly what my job is, to try and get that right. But we do remain amongst the leading science nations in the world by any metric, and we should not forget that, and we should not forget that if you lose that, it's unbelievably difficult to get back again.
So excellent, fantastic point. Right, 3 questions, 1 minute each, or 1.5 minutes each. We've got the Regulatory Innovation Office from Steve.
Yeah, thank you. In terms of the RIO and how it's been set up, what are the regulatory barriers that we're hoping it's going to overcome, and then how does it play into the development of the industrial strategy as well? What role does it play in that? Thank you.
So we've set it up focused around new technologies. What barriers is it trying to overcome? The fact that lots of new companies have to go to 7, 8, 9, 10 different regulators, that regulators aren't joined up on some of the new things, that regulators might not have the expertise, that the regulation may not be suitable, therefore you need sandboxes to do it. And we've got some examples already in the 4 areas we've chosen to start with in the Regulatory Innovation Office. We're working closely with the MHRA on AI and healthcare. We've been working with the CAA on issues of drones and autonomy and how you can free that up for them to be able to go across longer distances outside of line of sight. And we've been working with the Food Standards Agency on a sandbox for cultured meat.
I'm going to ask the final 30 seconds of that. How do you pick what goes in? What's the process for? Is it sort of picking winners, or is it do companies come to you, sectors come to you? what's the process for
We
getting
picked
into
4
the-
areas to start off with,
Yeah.
which we thought were the biggest potential growth areas, and I was very keen that the office didn't try and do everything, otherwise it would go very slowly. So I want to see success in 4 areas, and then we'll expand across other areas, which will be based on perceived company need, what we're hearing, and where we think there's growth potential from new technologies.
Thank you. That's very helpful. R&D tax credits and VAT. I think first is hopefully a simple question on the zero rate of VAT currently enjoyed by medical and veterinary sciences. Are you looking at, I know obviously the spending review question, but is there a discussion about extending that to other research disciplines?
No.
Thank you. Excellently quick short answer. R&D tax credits. R&D tax credits are about 7 billion, which is effectively a third of the science spend, though it's not accounted for as in the 20.4 billion science spend. Do you think it is successful in driving private sector innovation? And are you looking at or discussions on reform of the system to better support R&D whilst preventing fraud?
Well, there's a lot of work being going on that, as you know, and worries about people claiming it inappropriately, and Treasury have been looking at that very hard to make sure that we get that right. R&D tax credits have been an important part of the system. They're particularly important actually for some sectors who find them more valuable than others. So I think we have a very competitive R&D tax credit rate that is part of why we can attract companies here and why we keep them. But as I've said, what we've now got to do is make sure that translates into sustainable growth of companies, which may need different things to be thought about as well.
Is that something that R&D tax credit should be doing, or is that something that your department is looking at as part of the bucket?
Other areas. I'm specifically looking at what needs to be done to allow companies to scale and grow, and doing it in combination with DBT and Treasury.
Thank you. And now finally, I believe, and we only have a minute left for this, it's a very important area, space.
Thanks, Chair. Patrick, I know you understand that the space sector is one of those sectors that's key to so much of the other priorities. It's key for blue sky science, a great experimental test bed for health, quantum effect research on the moon, driving the regeneration of Glasgow, pulling through strategic SATCOMs. It's a key sector, and I just wanted to ask where you see it sitting in, back to the S&T framework, the industrial strategy. Obviously, OneWeb has now been sold. We still have a golden share. Do you see us? Do we have ambitions for our space sector, or should it conclude that the action is elsewhere around the world?
No, I think we do have ambition. It's under Minister Bryant's portfolio, and I'm there to sort of make sure the R&D bit can get supported. So it's very much under him. But yes, of course we have ambitions there. It's an important area for the UK, as you say, both in terms of what we do with it, so things like Earth observation and other areas, and indeed the potential for a launch. Saxavord and the money announced last week to try and get advance of a project from Orbex. 20 million investment there. So yes, there's definitely things that are seen as important, and as you know very well, that possibility of getting a launch into polar orbit is rather important, actually.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you, Patrick and Alex. You have spent a considerable amount of time with us. We've covered a lot of very different areas. I think it's a testament to the interest of the committee in the work you're doing, not surprisingly. But I want to really thank you for the way in which you have responded to our questions and to the time that you spent with us. And I'm sure we will be following, as you can no doubt imagine, we will be following your work with interest. I think there's going to be a couple of letters that we'll be writing to you coming out of this, but for the moment, thank you so much for the time you've both spent with us. And,
thanks very much.
And we look forward to working with you in the future.
Thank you, likewise. And I hope that some of the things I've talked about will give greater transparency on where money goes and what the effect of that money is, which is the important thing.
Thank you.
And the impact it's having on all our constituents' lives.
Exactly.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very
Thank
much.
you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Order.